welcome to the talk. Thank you all for coming. It's more people than I expected, so it's cool. And nice to see some familiar faces as well. So, adaptive audio for indies is what we're here to talk about. So, who am I? My name's Zander Hulme. I'm a professional. That's weird to say that. Professional, a game audio professional. So I make music and sound effects for video games, and that's what I do for a living. And that's really cool that I get to do that, and really glad I get to do that here in the Brisbane scene. And I often want to say something like I'm an adaptive audio expert, because that's the thing I like to do. And that's my field of expertise, and I'm writing a thesis on it and all that kind of stuff. But really, just like probably the rest of you, I'm just a big nerd. So I'm an adaptive audio nerd, and that's what I like to do and what I like to talk about. You probably haven't heard any of my work, but if you played Sling Kong, you have. And if you played Steppy Pants, which we launched on Wednesday, then you've also heard my work. In fact, these shoes might sound familiar. I'm not sure. Yeah, so... love Foley work. These are my Foley shoes. So if you ever need footsteps, you come to me. I'll record them for you. Right. So I want to start with the question: why do games even have sound? And does anybody have an answer to that question for me?
Why not?
Why not? Why not? Well, in a sense, we've sort of got this ability. We've got this. This is an audio-visual interactive medium. Why not have sound? Well, yeah, sure, we can have it there. It's an extra sort of added layer of entertainment that keeps it engaging. If you've ever seen somebody like watching TV and playing a game at the same time, or something like that, or reading while listening, or something like that, we find, especially now, people want more engaging. Like if you want to actually catch someone's attention completely, you need something visual and something audio to sort of be their full focus. I don't know if that's a comment on where we're going or something, but really there's also a bunch of other reasons why to have sound, and here are some basic distinctions. There's lots of, I guess, smaller distinctions you could have, but in my research I'm looking at sound basically having three purposes in games, which is emotion, information, and immersion. So emotion generally is a musical thing, and you want to have music that matches the gameplay, and, well, because games are really quite emotional. And some people want to say that they're not, they're just, just a bit of fun. But really, games are, like, a good game is really emotionally engaging, and music and sound are a huge part of that. And then information. Sound really does so much for games in terms of information. If you think about the kind of narrative we want to tell in tutorials, you want to teach players how to play games without just saying everything to them, right? You don't want big block text to explain everything, right? Music and sound does a similar thing. It can give players immediate feedback and give them information without explicitly saying, you need to do this, or look out, this is happening, or any of that kind of thing. So sound is hugely useful in that capacity. Much more useful, especially when you do it well and people don't notice. You hear footsteps behind you, you turn around because I've got to do this thing. You don't think, I'm hearing a sound, it's coming from this direction, I've got it, When you do sound really well, players don't notice it, but it still gives them a whole lot of information. And then immersion is the big one, is the thing, is the holy grail of game design. We want players to be immersed in a game. We want people to forget about the outside world and be engaged and just sort of live it, which is fantastic and something that music really helps with. And unfortunately, it's more something that we miss out on when we have poor sound design or poor music implementation. And it breaks the immersion, because suddenly you start thinking about the music because it's doing something weird, or you're thinking about this sound because you've heard the same one over and over again. And it's like, oh. So basically, we've got these different categories of sounds that I deal with when I'm doing a game. And they say, what sounds do we need? We make out a spreadsheet. We list them all off like this. But these are the important sort of categories. And those are their sort of purposes. Well, that's all well and good. But games are becoming more sophisticated, which is great, because that's what we want to be doing with games. We want to be making them better and cooler and everything. But the old approaches we had to sound design don't really work anymore. Because as games become more realistic, we expect sound and stuff to be more realistic. It doesn't quite match very well. So I've got an example here. This is one of my first video game experiences, was playing Alex Kidd and the Lost Stars on my sister's Sega Master System. And if we have a quick listen to the sound design in this game, it's not terribly sophisticated. So this is all 8-bit, but we've got a bit of voiceover there in crunchy 8-bit recording. We've got so this was all right at the time, but basically we've got all these sounds are symbolic. They're all symbolic sounds. There's nothing in here which is, well, actually, they're very realistic scream when you get hurt. But generally, all these sounds are symbolic sounds. And that's all we could manage to do because you only had an 8-bit PSG and you had to synthesize every sound. You couldn't put in a recording of footsteps or anything like that. And so when you get this whoop 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 kind of Pac-Man sound in a lot of games to sort of give it this idea of walking. But that doesn't really sort of work terribly well. If I can, no, I can't. All right, so we've got problems. Sound effects and music have different problems in games. Sound effects have the problem of repetition, where if you hear the same sound effect, the exact same one over and over again, you start noticing it. You don't think of it as being, I knocked over a bottle of water and it made the sound that I'd expect that to make. If every single time, if you knocked over like 100 of them or 100 of them in a room and they all made that same sound, it sounds fake and you notice that and it sort of breaks a bit of that immersive quality. So that's bad. We've got phasing issues, where if you have two of the exact same recording playing slightly out of sync with each other, the sounds don't just sound like there's two of it. The sound waves interact in a weird way because it is the exact same formation. And you get these problems called phase cancellation, where it basically makes a sound thin or hollow, or it's just the same sound but twice as loud, and other problems like this. So that's sort of a bit of an issue for sound effects, because that's not what you're trying to convey. You're trying to convey multiple things happening at once. And then technical constraints, because sure, we could have a million variations on something, but there's going to take up a lot of space. We want to try, we're kind of limited to how many sounds we can play at once, and other problems like that, especially if you're working in mobile. Music, we got looping fatigue. I know a lot of the old games, the classics, have these fantastic but quite short tunes. If they're ba 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 da da, it's a great tune, it's really catchy, and it just plays over and over again, does nothing else. That can get kind of distracting when you recognize the looping point and you hear it going over and over again, and it gets to a point where that gets annoying and you switch the sound off. If you're playing a phone game or something, and you hear that same piece of looping music and you're like, I'm sick of this. So that's a problem. Mismatched music, of course, where you've got some happy music playing, but then something sad happens in the game, but the happy music's still playing, and you're like, this isn't right. That pulls you out of immersion as well. And technical constraints, because actually streaming compressed music is an issue, and then having uncompressed music and running that can be an issue because of the amount of space it takes up. So there's a lot of sort of things to contend with here. So we have adaptive audio solutions. Yay! And these really excite me because it helps us get around these problems with some cool solutions. So first, I thought I'd take you through a couple of the kind of things that you'd need a sound designer or someone who's done audio implementation or someone who's an expert in Fmod or Wise or Fabric or any of those sort of middleware solutions. So I'll take you through a couple of these cool things that we can do, and then after that I'll have a look at some of the things we can actually just do as indies. If you're just a programmer or a designer, so long as you can use a game engine like Unity or Unreal, then these are the kind of things you could actually implement yourself and make work for you. So here's a cool thing. This is by, if anyone knows how to pronounce that name, Asbjørn Andersen has a great little article he wrote on doing, he called it procedural sort of sound effect making. But really what he's doing is he's looking at one of the common ways to design sounds in games is you take a lot of different sounds from different sources and you layer them together to make a sound. And now if you want to make variations on that sound, you can swap out some of the components and swap in different ones. And then the sound is varied. So what he's done here is, here's an example of, he's layered together a bunch of sounds, and it's going to play over and over again. Okay, so you're fairly used to that explosion sound. If every time you heard an explosion in a game, it was that same explosion sound, it stops becoming, that thing exploded and starts becoming a symbolic sound. Like an Alex Kidd, like you hear a boot for a jump or something. That's like, oh, that's the explosion sound. You don't feel like, we don't need this happening. You don't feel like the, and that's not what I meant to do either. Oh, crumbs. Sorry, I've done the wrong thing again. You don't feel like the sound has actually, is coming from the thing that you're blowing up. And so then the illusion is shattered, and now you're thinking about the sounds. So here, he's put together I've got money on that chair. I'm excited. So here, he's got a bunch of the different sound sources that he'd been using to make the other sound. And now he's programmed these to randomly select one of the components from each category. And it constructs a new explosion sound every time. So now, using this number of files, you get, what, the exponential of these combined? That's a lot of different variations you can produce. And so the player is no longer hearing the exact same sound effect, ever, like hardly ever. So that's one explosion. A different one. So now we've got variation and interesting stuff happening. So that's kind of cool. And yeah, you can read his full article. I'll post these slides and you can read the full article on that, which is very interesting. So here's another cool thing. Oh, autoplay. That's embarrassing. All right. So another thing that's probably a bit beyond our scope here is mixing for importance. Because you want to look at, if there's a lot of things going on, you need to narrow down what's most important to the player information-wise. And somebody who does this really well is Blizzard. Blizzard are so good with their sound design stuff. Goodness, they're just awesome. Sorry, I just need to read. I've got 6:47. Okay. Got to queue up all these YouTube videos. So. That would just go away. I could see the time code. That. They need like a blow gesture to make any like mouse hovering thing go away. But, oh crap.
Overwatch is a great sounding video.
Okay. So. But at Blizzard, they do some really cool stuff. And
It is.
Oh, what? Well, this is embarrassing. I'm sorry. So I don't know how many of you here have played Overwatch yet, but I know I've been really enjoying it. And the sound design is also really cool. Okay. Okay, so here's an example from Overwatch with without their importance system that they put in. This is hearing every sound that happens in the game.
And in comparison, here is the same clip, but with those 6 lines in place. This is what Overwatch actually sounds like when you play. It's a gigantic difference.
Hi. Enemy turret down. Clearing the area.
So there you can see that the sound design is actually really helpful in playing the game. And the way they decided what was important sound there was it was based on the distance it would take you to travel to the thing that was making the sound, and whether the thing was on your team, whether it was a threat to you, and various other things they take into consideration. And every player in the game has their own sound mix. So that's a really cool thing you can do with sound design. Because there are, naturally, especially in war games and shooting games, there's a lot of tendency for wanting very realistic gun sounds and that sort of thing. But you also need to be able to then decide what's actually important to be hearing at this time. So now I'd like to look at modular scores in music, where you basically write different music for different sort of sections, and then you move between these different sections to match the mood of whatever's going on. So this is from one of my favorite games, which is Monkey Island 2. Which is not very loud, unfortunately, over this wind. So this is the IMU system. This is done by, well, co-developed by Peter McConnell, and he wrote the score for this. And basically, as you move throughout this town of Woodtick, you go into different areas, the music changes, and it transforms for each of the different sections you go into. It kind of blows my mind how clever this is, the way that this is not crossfading. This is not just like having two different things and crossfading between them. It actually picks a point in the music that's a good time for a change, plays a little musical change that segues into the next section. Really cool shit. Right, so that's an example of that. Another cool thing that we can do in games is scalic elements. We can have bits of sound design sound musical. And in that way, we can make them a bit more engaging and a bit more cool and adaptive. So Two Dots is a game that does this well. Very simple game from Melbourne developers. The music's all done by Upright T-Rex. And so they've used sound design elements which are similar to the instruments in the soundtrack. And as you interact with the game, you'll hear the notes run up the scale. So you join these things together. And I think there's, sorry if I can just skip further in. So we can hear how it's a really simple thing, but what they've done is they've just made it so that the key of the music is in the same key as the scale that the notes run up. Usually they just use a pentatonic scale or something like that, which in non-music speak is just sort of cheating notes, just notes that are never wrong in this scale. So you're playing something in this key, you can always play these notes, they'll sound okay, they won't clash. And so that works nicely. Another cool example is Peggle To, which, I mean, is not that cool, but the music is really flippin' special. So the music for this is done by Guy Whitmore, and he made this system that knows what chord is currently being played in the music, and then it matches all the in-game sound design elements to be in key with that chord that's currently being played in the music. So here we'll see you drop the pinball, it hits the pegs make note sounds. But all of these sound design elements are all being intelligently told to be playing notes that will work with the key of the music. So it works almost like an interactive music thing. Really cool stuff from Guy Whitmore. Monument Valley is another one you've probably heard of. And this is actually quite simple. People really loved it and thought, wow, the sound design, this is amazing. And it's very well done and very well implemented. But it's not very complex. It's actually, all the music is just very ambient, very sort of kind of drones and things like that. And all of the little gameplay elements are all in a certain key, and they just interact and make sounds depending on your interactions. So really, like, the music in this is very simple, but the way that they've implemented it with the sound design is very clever, and it works beautifully. And that's the thing that people say about games like this is, it's beautiful. And part of that is not just in the art style, but in the way that it responds to your input as a user, and having good sound design really aids with that dramatically. Another cool thing that you can do with games is to give musical dependencies to various elements in the game that go off and sort of do their own thing. So in this game called Mini Metro, with a score by Rich Freeland, it's about building a little train system. And you've got stations, and you've got trains going between the stations. And each of the trains plays a note as it goes along. And so you get this sort of like ambient score constructed by the game as you play. And you get little sort of percussion sounds for things appearing, for passengers being picked up and dropped off. And so everything you do becomes musical, which is really cool. Another cool thing, which is it's very hard to do on mobile platforms and things like that, is layered scores. But here's a great little simple example. It was Super Mario World, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. And I'm a big fan of Super Mario World, but I just wanted to show you the thing with Yoshi, because it's a very simple, super simple thing they just did here, but they've got an extra percussion layer for when you're on Yoshi. So the music all stays the same. You hop on Yoshi, there's bongos added in. So this is going on. Really simple, but really effective. And then the last one I wanted to show you for layering stuff was Portal 2, because they did a superb job of it. So they actually had, I mentioned this briefly in my Lightning Talks last year, but they had elements of the game which are actually producing the music. So the music has been split up into layers, and the different elements in the game produce the different layers of music. So each of the instruments in the track is assigned to a different game object.
Australia.
Oh, goodness. Come on. Do not need to know about Whopper for PM. Come on. Anyway, I think I'm running on, so we'll skip that. But basically, all the instruments were different puzzle elements in 3D space. As you walk towards them, they got louder and softer, and it mixed the music on the fly. Procedurally generated music, this is really exciting. This is, I talked to this guy, Daniel Brown, who just a while ago did his PhD on generating piano scores on the fly for Super Mario 3D World. He's just recently worked on Rise of the Tomb Raider, where he's made this percussion system which makes a drum track on the fly for the gameplay, for the battle. And this is just it in-game as it goes. And then it comes down again, and then it does other things. But it's really clever. It basically works by knowing a bunch of different rhythms and strings them together and plays different instruments together and speeds up and slows down. It's really quite sophisticated, and it's really cool that this is the kind of stuff we can be doing now in games. And it very much excites me and scares me a little bit, because as a composer, I might be becoming obsolete. But now I'd like to talk to you about how we as indies can actually do cool stuff with game audio, because, well, that's why we're here, right? So Randomize Elements is a really simple one. But basically we can have pools of sound effects, and instead of always drawing the same footstep sound, we can draw from a pool of footstep sounds, and then you're not going to hear the same sound repeated over and over again until it becomes a symbolic thing. You're just going to hear footsteps. So I've got a little video of Steppy Pants playing, because that's the only one I could find for this. But each of these footsteps is different. All the coin sounds all come from a pool of sounds that I made. And each of those coins landing in your HUD there, that's all just drawn from a pool of different sounds. And so with that sort of variation, you're not thinking about hearing that same footstep sound. It doesn't sort of get tiresome, because it's all drawn from a pool of about 12 different steps for each character, or each type of shoe, anyway. And same with actually that metal thud from the robot hitting the ground, robot body, that also is drawn from a pool of sounds. So it's especially useful for anything where you've got these sort of like physics-based interactions, like the things falling about in the ground and stuff like that. It really becomes quite obviously cheap sounding if you use the same sound effect triggered every time that happens. So that's a nice simple one you can do with, I know we did that in Unity. This is a really cool one actually, because it's sort of like, I loved Super Mario Galaxy. I thought it was like a Super Mario 64 for the modern day. It was fantastic. But one of the things I noticed about it was, when you're in like the main hub, selecting levels, across the game as you progress, the music changes. So this is when you first arrive in the hub, this is the music. All right, yep, cool, whatever. After you've got like 25 stars or something, it changes. And so as you keep moving along in the game, you come back to the same place you've been coming back to all along, and there's a slight variation. It's a bit different now. It's not the annoying same loop you've heard a million times, because it's changed. And now we've got more instruments, different stuff happening, which is really cool. And then they do this, there are 3 or 4 variations. And this one has French horns in this beginning bit. And a counter melody as well. So we're not just adding sort of texture, we're also adding additional melodic content and things like that. Does anyone else get a frisson from that crescendo there? Oh, I love it. It's good. Okay, and here's a nice little cheat one actually, which I noticed in Super Mario Galaxy 2 when I started playing it. Because you open it up and the first thing you see is this menu. I think I'll just let it do its thing. So you press start, and then it loads up the actual game, and you get the opening sequence, which is this. Well, that's not it. But you think the title comes up, it has a big fanfare, and then you continue on into level selection, and the music calms down and gets into... And now we're in level selection music. I'm doing this, and this is cool. Oh, and now there's drums. Okay. The drums there are actually an adaptive layer that's added in whenever you select what save game you want to open on your game. But that sort of changing from the big fanfare into the levels, like the choose your game music, that's not adaptive at all. That's just, they figured out when they play that big fanfare, they show the continue button after a certain amount of time, players hit it, it syncs up more or less almost every time. So it doesn't have to be adaptive when you just know that your player behavior is going to be, unless you play the game a million times, you're trying to skip through as quickly as possible, that's what you can predict people are going to do. So sometimes you can just sort of pretend that it's working with it and people don't even think about it, which is what you want. So remembering where we left off is a really good one, because I know, for example, in phone games, you've got like menu music or something. Two Dots does this actually, where you keep coming back to the same menu music, and kind of like the hub in Super Mario Galaxy that gets a bit old, and you want to change it up. Well, in Two Dots, what they did was they wrote a really long level selection piece of music, and when you go and you pick your level, it pauses, it remembers where you're up to. You play that level, you come back, it starts from there again, and so on. And so the player doesn't hear the same introduction every single time they get to the level select. They're hearing a new part of the larger whole, which is really handy and really simple, and you don't even need like a composer on your team or anyone to do that. You just need to be able to pause the music, resume it. Do that with stock music you bought. Works great. DSP, really powerful, really handy, really more in the league of programmers and stuff you can do with Unity and such. Fez has a great example of this. If I need to bring up, the thing to tell me 840. So Fez uses DSP. Fez was the music designed by Rich Freeland, also known as Disaster Piece. He is a really cool cat. Come on. So we've got some cool DSP happening here. What we've got is a low-pass filter, and that basically sweeps down and cuts out the high frequencies from the sound, from the music. And that's a filter you can just apply to anything. It's really cool. But here what happens is, see how it gets kind of quiet when you switch it so you're behind the building? He'll do it again in a minute. Now you can't hear very well on these speakers, but that's not just getting quieter. That kind of sounds like it's underwater. That's a low-pass filter effect coming on and sweeping down and sweeping back. And it has a sort of whoop, whoop kind of sound to it as well, which is really cool and actually quite simple to implement. Done to great effect in a number of things, actually. Super Mario Bros. New also has a bit of DSP where we're using reverb. Quite often reverb is not really thought about with music and such, but you can apply it to music. And I didn't write a note of where to start this video. But when you, come on, maybe that'll be better. That is not what I meant to do. Come on. But when you're in the underground sections in Super Mario Bros., you actually get reverb. They also did that on the old games as well, actually. I think in Super Mario 3, if you went underground, you could hear reverb because... No, sorry, Super Mario World. Because in the SNES, they developed that technology to allow reverb and other effects like that to be played on the sound chip. Don't know what happened there. But anyway, so they add reverb as an effect to the music that it tells you more about the space you're in and all that kind of stuff. And super duper simple to implement. Unity's got quite a powerful reverb plugin that it's already there. Transistor's also makes really great use of DSP. Transistor has a low-pass filter. Come on. At 1 minute.
Hey, Red. What?
Don't know if any of you have played Transistor,
I'm not gonna get away with this.
but I thought it was beautiful, and the music's fantastic. Now we see this happening right here. So, oh, bloody hell. Should have thought this through, hadn't I? All right. That can go away. When you're fighting in this, it's not just a hack and slash, it's got this planning part, right? So you can strategize your moves before you make them. And what happens when you enter this planning mode, should happen soon, everything sounds like it's underwater. So one, they add in the extra instrument of her humming as a little melodic thing on top, but everything else sucks away like it's going underwater. And it's a really great use of DSP. And Darren Korb, who made the score for this, is fantastic. He doesn't actually know anything about it. So they didn't sort of need his expertise to make that happen or anything. It's just actually not that hard to do, which is really cool. But it has a huge effect. And it also feels like you can have this quite dramatic and intense sort of battle music going on. And when you're in this space where it's like, this is a resting space, you can plan now. Really changes the mood for that focus and straightforward, yes, I can plan this. And then bam, back into the action when it resumes, which is really so effective. It's really great. Okay, just before we wrap up on this, I thought I'd take a quick moment just to talk about my research that I'm doing into audio stuff, because that's my passion and all that. I've got a little project I've got here. We can open another tab, I think. That's it. Okay. So I've actually developed a system for doing adaptive audio in games. I've got an example here that works with sort of the intensity of the music, but really you could apply this to anything, to transitioning between stuff. And my plan is more or less to make crossfades obsolete, because crossfades are they really bother me, and I think on a subconscious level they bother you too, you just don't know it. Really what happens is if you have a long crossfade between two different distinct tracks in different keys, then they clash while they're crossfading. And it's really sort of unpleasant. It sort of takes you out of the space of what's going on. And it's an effect. It's like if you're watching a film and they crossfade it between every shot, you think, what are they doing here? What's going on with that? And in games it's a little bit that way. It's a standard thing, so we just do it, but really it should be an artistic decision. This is an aesthetic choice. We want to do the crossfade because it has that effect. It does have a certain effect to it. But if you use it all the time, it loses that effect, and it's just sort of an annoying thing that's not as good. And if it draws your attention to the changing music, then it's already lost its point. Because the point in changing the music is that it matches the gameplay. It matches everything that's going on, and it keeps you immersed in the game and really engaged. And crossfades can sometimes sort of ruin that, because you notice that sort of happening, and you're like, oh, okay, that's fading out, this is fading in, I know what's going to happen now, etc., etc. So I'm working on a system that does this. It runs more or less at about the same, has about the same overhead as Unity's compressed audio streaming function. So that uses about that amount of RAM and processing power to run, which I think is kind of cool. But this is an example of how it works. So we start the track. It's quiet. I can start ramping it up. So this is all live recorded music. And so this kind of thing is, thank you, it's allowing it to blend between, we're hopping between different musical intensities that these live instrumentalists have recorded with them. And what we're doing here is we're not fading from one thing to the next thing. We're actually preserving all the natural decay of the instruments so that they overlap. I call it imbricate audio. And basically which just is like, what you call anything. It's like roof tiling that overlaps in that way. But it's yeah, it's a distinctly different sound, and just subconsciously, when you hear this happening, it sounds like musicians changing as they do in a piece of music, right? If you're watching a scene in a film and this, it's got dramatic curves and peaks, the music shifts to do that, and you just expect that to happen, and that's fine. You stay engaged, and the music does its job of making you feel the way it should. Whereas if you hear transitions and what's going on, that can draw attention away from it. So I'm looking at basically being able to make these transitions without crossfading between them. The other cool thing is that when you tell it to stop, it's not pausing. I'm not just like pausing the music, right? We got the musicians stop playing. It's not cut short in the middle of a note. It's divided into distinct sort of chunks. And it also responds in under a second whenever I press one of these buttons. Anyway, so that's that. Yeah, that's about all I've got to say in regards to that. But so that's actually my master's project that I'm wrapping up this year. But I'm hoping to have it implemented in a number of games soon. In fact, I'm working on one at the moment that it's in. I used a primitive version of it in Sling Kong as well to queue up the music chunks in that, which has a sort of a pseudo-layered score. But these are the sort of this is, I guess, sort of beyond the scope of someone who's not an audio nerd trying to implement, unless you hire me, and then it is in your scope to put this into your game. But I hope that some of these things I've brought up, they're not, I haven't sort of taken you through how to do things in a step-by-step way, but really, your programmers, your designers, your people who like to do and figure out things. And if you know that this is possible and it's not too hard to do, and you can do it with the tools you have available to you, then I'm sure you can work it out. But yeah, I'm also happy to talk to people about stuff and consult on things and just have a chat anytime, really. So do we have any questions regarding more or less anything? Sorry? No, you. Yeah.
Can you talk at all about how your machine system works, or is it all under wraps at the moment?
Oh, no, this is going to be my contribution to knowledge. So it's actually, it's not, there's no NDAs here. But it's really quite simple. It's just a queuing system that tells on Unity's DSP clock, start playing this next clip at exactly this time, and so on. And then I've got 5 different tracks of music that I've recorded. And you could do this with MIDI, you could bounce it out so it preserves the tails. But I did it with live recorded musicians, and it was kind of tricky. But basically, in this music where we've got say for example, the cymbal in play was a dum, dee da dee da dee dum, da dum. What they'd actually play in the studio was dum, dee da dum, deep, dum, dilly, dum, da 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 da. So every odd numbered bar they'd play, and I'd record the ringing out of the last note into the next bar. And then they'd hear that back and hear dum, dee da dee da dee dum, diddly ah, dum, dee da dee da dee. And they'd play all the alternating bars. And then once I've chopped all that up, I've got a smooth running thing where I can say, start playing this, okay, and as that's ringing out, you layer that one under it, and so on. And you can just keep doing that the whole time. And it loads everything into RAM and then clears it out of the RAM afterwards, so it's only using about less than 3 megabytes of RAM to run this program, and or to run the audio in it, and only about 1.5% of my CPU. But it's that's basically how it's done, and I did that at 5 different levels of intensity, and then just made it so that when you press a button or give some cue from in the game, it'll hop between tracks. In that it'll know, okay, instead of queuing the next mezzo piano one, we're going to queue, bar 57 as mezzo forte, and then it just puts that one in the system instead and runs through. Anything else?
And so just further elaborating on that, when you hit stop, it just waits till the end of that bar.
It just continues, basically it just stops the cue. So when it knows every time it's in the middle of playing a thing, it'll wait until it's less than a tenth of a second before the changeover, and it'll say, are we still going to play the next thing? Yeah, we are. Cue that one in, and loads it in, and does that. And when you say stop, then when it gets to that point, it goes, are we playing the next thing? No, we're not, just let it ring out.
So you could also cue an outro if you wanted to.
Absolutely, yeah. So you could, when you press stop, it can either wait until it finds like a musically appropriate time to play it, or it can play one straight away. And that's the kind of thing the iMuse system did actually, like in Monkey Island 2 where I was showing you, where it has, you walk into the bar and it's got this other instrument playing, and when you walk out of the bar, it waits till the point in the music that it can tack on a little finishing bit for that instrument to finish off. But all that kind of stuff, it could be easily achieved with this. In fact, recently they did the Monkey Island 2 remastered, also the special edition, which had re-recorded music. The score sounded really great with live instruments. It's actually kind of how I remembered it. I didn't think about the sort of MIDI stuff they were doing. And it was great, but they didn't go to the effort to remake the iMuse system and make it work in the new way. So, but this technology could actually make that work for them if they wanted to do that, which they don't. But you could have that effect that they had back when they originally released the game of these totally smooth transitions between things, as if you had a live band sitting there playing the music for your game, and you're saying, we're going over here now, and the band leader goes, okay, we're going to change to that music. And they do the transition. I think ideally, if back when we had silent film, and you'd have an organist playing all the music for the film, and their scores were actually just composed of various little bits with instructions on when this happens, do this, when this happens, do that, and move around. And they knew the rules of what was going to go on, and they'd use their musical knowledge to transition between these bits. They didn't need to have the transitions written down for them. That's kind of what I foresee ideally game music working towards. It's like having a whole band here that understands music well and understands your game well. So when you know there's danger coming, and the game can tell the music engine that, it knows how to transition from where it is now into saying there's some danger coming and make that work. But I think we're a bit of a ways off that, but I think this kind of technology, even though it's super simple, really, it's a very simple approach, but I think it could be very effective.
It sounds like it's a lot more complicated to author music that way, though.
Yes, well, with live recording, I discovered, yes, it is. It's actually, if you're making like a modular score anyway, it's not much more work to write it. I'm looking at the idea of, because we've got quite sophisticated MIDI instruments now. We've got MIDI instruments that can sample from, as I was saying, how we had like pools of samples for sound effects. We've got pools of samples for musical instruments performing and other things that can sound really great. But we can't put that engine into a game. One, because you've got licensing issues that are just horrendous. And two, because it's huge work. If I'm running like, that's a 5-piece ensemble, if I were running that in, if I were running that in like with sampled instruments, in my instrument sampler, that'd be using up probably close to about nearly 10 gigabytes of RAM. And we don't really have the spare RAM for that to be doing while we're playing a game. So we can't implement these sophisticated music systems into games like that. But what we can do is we can use that software to produce the bum da dum da la, and produce those half bars, chop that all up, and then implement that without a huge amount of work really. And also, the musicians were not used to performing like that, but the MIDI doesn't give a crap, you know. It'll just do whatever. Yes?
Do you find you have to compose differently? Do you have to compose with that system in mind when you're writing music for it in terms of phrasing and things?
I did for the live instruments, and because I was trying to make this run on a phone was my constraint, that I wanted to make it so efficient it runs on a phone. But if you didn't have that constraint, you don't actually have to do that. So even though I've done, yes, I'm alternating phrases, you could have a pedal note, you could have a really long note that plays at the start here, and that can continue to overlap with several of the next things that come up. You don't have to unload the last one when you load in the next. you can actually have an overlap that lasts quite a long time. So really, while if you want a definite and certain immediate response within a second, within a second, or sooner if you like, then yes, you do need to think about phrasings that don't overlap too long like that.
Yeah.
But really, no, you can actually have quite long phrases and other things that don't get chopped up.
So it's just a memory kind of consideration.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, because this decompresses the audio on the fly, because this is about 120 meg of raw audio compressed into about 20 megabytes. And the engine has to decompress that on the fly and then play it, and then it clears it out of the RAM and does that. On a phone, that's going to become cumbersome if you've got several of those running at once, which is why you can't stream multiple things, which is why you can't do layered scores like I was showing you with the, even with like something like Super Mario. Those layered scores are quite difficult to do on a phone because Unity does not stream well. But if you weren't running on a phone, then you could have these extra layers. You could have really long phrasings and other stuff, and it wouldn't be a problem really.
And did you do the programming side of that as well, the back end?
Yeah, I wrote that all in C#.
Right.
Yeah, I learned C# to do it. So it's not that hard. Although, like, it is all spaghetti, but it's, it works. So that's that. That's something.
Worked pretty well there.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions at all? Oh, yeah?
Like, when do you think indie developers should start considering music and sound effects when developing their games?
That's a really good one. Because even though I can gladly say that I'm basically always in work at the moment, which is really great, it's like always crunch for me. Because people come to me right at the end of the development cycle and they're like, we need sound and we need music and we need it in a few weeks. Or something like that. And it's, depending on the size of your game, it's just, really, I think the ideal time to contact a composer or a sound designer is when you've already got your game design documents really nicely done. You've got concept art in place, you've got sort of the, if you have lore and mythology and all this other stuff, everything that is in the sort of design of your game that gives us its aesthetic visually, and you know what it's sort of about and what your themes are, then you're ready to say, this is what the game is about. We need music or sound that suits this. And that's like the ideal time. Because even though you're still ages away from actually finishing your game, you've still got all the actual making of it to do. That's when the composer's got enough to work with. Because if you have come much earlier than that, then you don't have enough information to give them a proper brief. And if you come much later than that, then they've got got to really rush to get everything in. And it's going to cost you more if they're charging you for their overtime and things like that. And also you've got less time to prototype and to back and forth and to develop things together. So I think that's probably the ideal time, really. Because even though, because composers generally work per asset, and sound designers also sometimes, by the assets that they provide, so per minute of music, or per sound effect provided, or per group, or whatever, rather than charging you for their hours. So if you contract someone, you go, I know I'm going to need 20 minutes of music for this game, and you contract someone early in the development process, you're not paying them any more than if you contracted them late. You're just getting more time for them to basically, stew over it more and do more iterations and polish it and provide you with something really great. It's not going to actually cost you more because they're charging you for the finished product. Anything else? All right, that's all. Well, thank you very much.